In Ukraine.
Ukraine.
In Ukraine.
In Kyiv today.
In Odessa.
In Kharkiv.
In
In the
Lviv.
city of Nikolaev in Ukraine.
Ukraine concerns them more than their own country. They continue to rewrite and appropriate history, manipulating and lying to excuse their crimes. This voice comes from Russia. We will tell the truth from Ukraine. We will debunk the myths and discredit the lies of common Russian propaganda. Starting August 19th, watch our series Real Ukraine, devoted to Ukrainian Independence Day, in our newscasts on UATV.
Kremlin-controlled media never stops repeating altered facts or completely made-up stories about alleged war crimes committed by the Ukrainian army against the civilian population of the Donbass.
Shelling from the side of Ukrainian terrorists. Absolutely monstrous artillery shellings.
I almost got killed 4 times.
Russia keeps denying that it is involved in the war, while its investigative committee continues opening criminal proceedings against Ukrainian soldiers. They keep accusing them of shelling residential areas.
89 people are suspected. Among them, 47 are representatives of the Ukrainian armed forces.
Television, internet, speeches at the UN and EU bodies, and street protests. The Kremlin uses all possible mediums to cultivate a negative image for the Ukrainian military. But the truth is completely different. This video was filmed by Russian invasion forces at the beginning of the war, and this is not the only case. In one interview, a separatist artillery officer under the call sign Korsa said that she fired at civilians from the Ukrainian side while posing as the Ukrainian military.
As I was moving through Ukrainian territory under the Ukrainian flag, I was shooting at targets.
This Kremlin terrorist did not specify what she was targeting, and this is understandable since she would have faced grave consequences such as prison or the death penalty. Another story worth mentioning is the shooting of a trolley bus in Donetsk in January 2015. Russian propaganda blamed the Ukrainian military, yet our colleagues from the Anti-Zombie Project debunked the myth long ago. Mortar shells could not reach Donetsk if shot from Ukrainian military positions, since it was too far away. This info was also supported by one of the Russian-backed militant leaders, Denis Letov.
There was infighting between Oplot and Russian Cossacks. Cossacks came to punish, and they were using a mortar to shell the headquarters of the Oplot. They missed and hit the trolley bus stop.
Soon after this speech, Letov was kidnapped and sent to prison by his own brothers-in-arms. This was the Kremlin's punishment for talking too much. So what could the Kremlin's goals be? Why would they blame the Ukrainian army for shelling civilians? One of those goals is to dehumanize Ukrainians. Ukrainian soldiers are portrayed as monsters killing civilians. Civilians in turn are being told that the Ukrainian army keeps killing, and imagine what would happen if Ukraine reclaimed all of Donbass.
A piece of land and 2 slaves.
By the way, this is how liberated Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, and Mariupol look. No curfew, salaries and pensions are paid on time, and people who express dissent are not arrested, killed, or kidnapped. The other reason for this propaganda spiel is that it presents useful tools for Russia to use and shift the blame onto Ukraine, and thus give other countries a reason to lift sanctions against Russia. Russia, the aggressor state, claims it is Ukraine which breaks treaties and international law. At the same time, they are trying to cover up their own crimes.
Попадание по дому, прямое попадание, да, это жесть.
February 2017, Avdiivka is being shelled by Russians using mortar shells and high-caliber artillery. Civilians are killed and houses are destroyed. December of the same year, the village of Novoluhansk gets hit with dozens of Grad missiles. It was a miracle that no one died. May 2018, a mortar shell killed a schoolgirl in Toretsk. The same year, on August 24th, the village of Rubrivka was shelled using high-caliber ordnance. A father of 2 was killed. This year, civilians were killed by Russian shellings in Chermolek, Krasnohorivka, and dozens of homes were burned down in Novoluhansk and Mariivka.
She cannot hear in one of her ears. A concussion probably caused by the blast wave.
This is just a small portion of crimes by the occupiers, but Russia will never declare these truths on their TV. It is always better to lie, just as their idols did.
Goebbels said that the more improbable the lie, the higher the chance that people will believe in it. And he reached his goals. He was a talented man.
I'm at the positions in the industrial zone with the 1st Motorized Battalion of the Vostok Brigade. The Ukrainian side started shelling us.
Ukraine has been combating the lies of Russia for 6 years, yet the forces are not equal, since Russia pumps out their stories about Ukrainian murderers faster than Ukraine can disprove them. Time and again, Russia proves that the suffering of people is simply a tool for them. Reported by Ihor Medelian, UATV.
Russian politicians and the Kremlin's propagandists are desperately trying to persuade the whole world that Crimea is Russian territory. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 is characterized by Russian propaganda as historical justice.
Knowing the history of Crimea is enough. Knowing what Russia meant for Crimea and Crimea meant for Russia.
But Russia is not the first country that has ties with the Crimean Peninsula.
Russian ownership of Crimean Peninsula began in 1783 and ended in 1954 with some short breaks, when Crimea was under European occupation in the 20th century. That is just around 5.5% of Crimea's recorded history.
That means that Crimea was a part of Russia for less than 200 years. At the same time, the Crimean Khanate existed for more than 300 years, from 1449 until 1783, when it was annexed by the Russian Empire.
They came to Crimea claiming they are there to protect the Christian population and that Christians belong to the Moscow Patriarchy. Arianist Christianity was widespread in Crimea from the 3rd century AD. There was also non-Arian Christianity, which belonged to the Constantinople Patriarchy. Urums were the ones belonging to this branch.
If we look at old census records, we will, to our surprise, or maybe without any surprise, see that 95% of Crimea's population was Crimean Tatars, while ethnic Russians comprised, best case scenario, about 6,000 people.
Using forced migrations of Russians to the peninsula and repressions against the Aboriginal population, the Russian Empire tried to increase the number of the Russian-speaking population. Yet, Russians only became the majority in Crimea after the deportation of the Crimean Tatars from the peninsula in 1943. In 1945, Soviet authorities started changing its toponymy.
The Regional Executive Committee was obliged to continue its work by renaming settlements, railway stations, rivers, valleys, and other locations with Tatar names. District committees were obliged to eradicate anything Tatar and combat the use of any Tatar words and names.
This was the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the RSFSR from August 21, 1945. Historic names, the evidence that Crimea is the homeland of the Crimean Tatars, disappeared from maps. Stalin's topographists were not very imaginative. That is why Karasu changed to Karasi, which means Kapers. Surin changed to Siren, which means Ilyak. There were also 4 villages called Molochne, meaning milky, 2 villages called Ivanovka, etc.
Without this state policy, without the encouragement of Russians to move to Crimea, without the encouragement of Crimeans to leave the peninsula in the 19th century, and without the deportation of Crimean Tatars in 1944, Russians would never have become the majority on the peninsula. Saying that Crimea is some kind of primordial Russian land is not just supporting Putin's perspective, it is acknowledging your own ignorance.
But the Kremlin's propagandists are using tools tested back in the Soviet times. They are substituting facts, rewriting history books, and attempting to persuade everyone that their opinions are objective reality. They are using lies to cover up their crimes. Reported by Imran Husseinov, UATV.
Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Russian officials and state-controlled media have focused huge resources on portraying the fighting in the Donbass as an internal conflict.
Киевские власти развязали гражданскую войну на юго-востоке Украины, пошли против тех, кто отказался принять результаты майданного госпереворота.
Yet, time and time again, photos and videos uploaded to social media prove the presence of Russian service personnel and military equipment in the Donbass region. Lieutenant General Serhiy Nayev, the former commander of the Joint Forces operation, estimates that out of at least 32,000 fighters in occupied Donbass, around 11,000 are Russian citizens.
Officers and generals of Russia's armed forces are holding leadership positions in these armed formations. I have to note that this is not some volunteer militia but regular forces. In their system, they are part of the 8th Combined Army Unit, which is stationed in the town of Novocherkassk in Russia.
Around 2.5% of mainland Ukraine is under the effective control of the Russian authorities, while pushing the idea that just local militia groups are involved in fighting. Moscow has been unable to convincingly explain how sophisticated Russian-made military equipment appeared on Ukrainian soil.
All of the weaponry, meaning tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery systems, and multiple launch rocket systems were produced in Russia and delivered to the occupied territories from there. They are also using the newest type of Russian weaponry.
50 types of modern Russian military technology have been spotted in the war zone since 2014. This is according to Ukrainian investigative volunteer organization Inform Napalm.
We are specifically talking about new developments which could not have been used by the Ukrainian military and were never used by the Soviet military. Russia is the only country which has it and produces it.
For example, here is a Russian T-72B3 tank. Russia started mass-producing this modification in 2011 at the Uralvagonozavod factory in the city of Nizhny Tagil. The Russian military put these tanks into service in 2014.
Our team noticed them during the Battle of Debaltseve in February 2015, thanks to the efforts of propagandist Graham Phillips, who filmed these new Russian tanks moving towards the front line.
This is a BPM-97 Vystrel. The Russian military began using them in 2008. It was assembled at the Remdiesel factory in the town of Naberezhnye Chelny. Ukraine never imported this armored vehicle, yet they were spotted in the occupied territories of the Luhansk region. Here are the same vehicles moving as part of a Russian convoy through the once occupied town of Sorokine, which was then called Krasnodon. They were filmed in January 2015, when the town was occupied by Russian hybrid forces, and this BPM-97 was parked on a street in the occupied city of Luhansk for several days. Over the course of the war, the newest Russian drones were spotted in the skies of Donbass. For example, the Orlan-10 is a multifunctional unmanned aerial vehicle produced in St. Petersburg. The Russian armed forces began using it in 2010. This UAV was spotted over Ukrainian territory in October 2018, where it was spying the Ukrainian military Mi-24 helicopter, which shot down the drone, and the remains of it were later found and studied. This is all just a small part of the evidence of Russia's military intervention in eastern Ukraine, reported by Artem Holob for UATV.
The monument to Grand Prince Volodymyr the Great in Kiev dates back to 1853. He brought Christianity to the region. And this is the monument dedicated to the great ruler in Moscow. It was unveiled near Red Square in 2016. Russian President Vladimir Putin called the Kievan prince his compatriot and the founder of the Russian state.
This new monument is a tribute to our distinguished ancestor, revered saint, statesman, warrior, and spiritual founder of the Russian state.
Putin has also called Yaroslav the Wise and his daughter Anne of Kiev Russians during a 2017 meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron.
Enlightened French people know about Anne, the Queen of France. She was the younger daughter of our Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, wife of Henry I, and she played an important role in the development of France.
In fact, in the times when Volodymyr was baptizing Rus and Anne of Kiev was the Queen of France, Moscow looked like this.
That territory was called Zalicia, or the land beyond the forest. There were Finno-Ugrian tribes living on those lands. Later, those lands were colonized by Kievan Rus. Only in the 12th century were the first principalities created.
The myth that Russia is a successor state of the Kievan Rus was not invented by Putin. This myth originated in the 15th century.
At the latest, at the end of the 15th century, when the Russian idea of the unification of all the former Kievan Rus under the authority of the Moscow Tsar emerged, the Muscovite elites then proclaimed the concept that Russia maintains until this day, that the statehood of Kievan Rus was inherited by Moscow. as if the dynasty of Kiev princes continued there. But it wasn't so.
The myth of the single nation was created in the 17th century, and it was used as an excuse for imperial expansion. Muscovites stopped being descendants of the mixture of Finnic, Turkic, and Slavic peoples and announced themselves the Great Russians, one of the offshoots of the ancient Rus people. Ukrainians were hence named Small Russians. Soviet historians morphed this myth into the idea of three brotherly nations: Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians.
In reality, and this is supported by archaeological finds, linguistic data, and written data, it was established that Ukrainians as a nation developed from Slavic roots, and when Ukrainian already existed, Russian did not. It started forming when the Ukrainian state already existed in the 12th century.
For centuries, Russia claimed that Ukraine is a nation with no historical roots, that supposedly Ukraine never had statehood and needs external control. Yet Kievan Rus is Ukraine. It was one of the biggest states in the Middle Ages. The early modern hetmanate existed as a state for more than 100 years. It had diplomatic recognition in the world. Ukrainian hetmans were treated as equals by kings and khans. Ukraine regained its independence in 1991, and it's no quirk in history or a random event, as Russia claims. It was a natural result of the nation's struggle for independence and sovereignty. Reported by Yulia Kuchkova, UATV. There is a war raging in Mariupol. This is one of the myths about the city. However, on the outskirts, there's fighting. The war is at the doorstep of Mariupol. This is Vostochny district. It was here on January 24, 2015, that rockets fired by Russian-led forces landed. 31 people were killed and 117 injured. Much of the vital infrastructure was destroyed. Local residents, volunteers, the military, and humanitarian missions joined forces to restore the neighborhood. And over 4 years later, it has been revived. People here often call Mariupol a peaceful frontline city. They don't take kindly to those saying there's fighting in the city, and neither to those who deny there's a war going on. Some 20 kilometers outside Mariupol is the front line where Ukrainian military are holding the defense.
The war is raging outside the city in the countryside. There is no war within the city. The Ukrainian army is defending us. I am very grateful to our defenders.
We live a peaceful life here owing to our military, who sacrifice their own lives and their well-being to defend us on a daily basis.
Another myth is that normal life in Mariupol has ground to a halt and that people stopped coming to the city for vacations. This is not the case. Mariupol continues to develop. Recreational areas and parklands are being renovated, as are schools and hospitals. Tourists come here to relax on the beaches along the Azov Sea coast and to spend a weekend at music festivals. Just recently, thousands flocked to the annual Mariupol Fest. The myth about Mariupol residents being unpatriotic was refuted a long time ago by the residents themselves. Since the beginning of Russia's undeclared war, volunteers in Mariupol have been helping the Ukrainian military. When the enemy stood on the city's doorstep, the locals unfurled a giant flag of Ukraine in the central square. And it was the Mariupol residents who launched My Flag, My Pride campaign to celebrate Flag Day. It quickly spread online, with people posting their pictures with Ukrainian symbols on social media, leaving no doubt that Mariupol is Ukraine. Reported by Nadia Sukharukova for UATV.
The first myth: Ukrainian is an artificial language created in the 18th century by nobleman Ivan Kotlяревsky. To debunk this myth, we came to the golden decked 11th century cathedral. Medieval inscriptions have been preserved on its interior walls till these days.
It is a 12th century graffiti. There is an assumption that it was written by Kievan Prince Volodymyr Monomakh. It says, "Lord, help your slave, Volodymyr," not Vladimir, as it is used in Russian. Over 7,000 graffiti that date back from the 11th to the 18th century have been preserved till this day. Thanks to these inscriptions, we can learn how the Ukrainian language developed.
The second myth. Ukrainian is a dialect of Russian. That is why the two languages have a lot in common. In fact, Ukrainian is closer to Belarusian, Czech, Slovenian, and Polish than to Russian. Let's compare. Red in Russian is krasny, while in Ukrainian червоний, in Polish червоний, and in Belarusian червоний.
Найбільше спільних рис в українською.
Ukrainian has the largest number of lexical similarities with Belarusian, that is 84%, with Slovakian 72%, Polish 70%, and with Russian only 62%. This means if we take a sentence consisting of 10 words, only 6 of them will be similar in Ukrainian and Russian, in Slovakian, Polish, and Ukrainian, 7 words, and in Belarusian and Ukrainian from 8 to 9.
The third myth. The eastern regions of Ukraine were always Russian-speaking. In fact, modern-day Donbass had always been Ukrainian since the Cossack era. However, time passes. After committing the Holodomor, the Soviet authorities decided to bring Russians to the territory of southern and eastern Ukraine. A regulation of the Council of USSR People's Commissars from October 25, 1933 says that 21,000 Russian families were planned to be settled in these areas.
The Holodomor, or the man-made famine in particular, killed millions of Ukrainians who lived in modern Donetsk, Kharkiv, and Luhansk regions. In fact, it led to a devastating result for Ukrainian ethnicity. That is why the territory was later settled by people both from Ukraine and remote parts of Russia. Thus, the language transformations occurred after the Holodomor.
The fourth myth. Ukrainian is widely spoken only in western regions of the country, mainly in rural areas. Polls conducted by the Razumkov Center in 2017 say that 68% of Ukrainians consider Ukrainian to be their mother tongue, while 14% of Ukrainians consider Russian to be their native language. Only 17% consider both Ukrainian and Russian to be their mother tongue. It is true that Ukrainian is the most widely used in the western regions, as there it is spoken by 83% of respondents, in central Ukraine by 84%.
When these events began in eastern Ukraine in 2014, many people reoriented themselves and began to speak Ukrainian. It was the instinct of preservation of their national identity, so to say. They thought, you act like this? Then I will defend my Ukrainian traits.
The fifth myth is about the new language law adopted on April 25th this year. The myth says that Russian speakers will be detained by language inspectors, and those who don't know Ukrainian will face criminal liability.
There is no criminal liability at all in the law. There is only administrative liability. So you might pay a fine, for example, when you provide some services to people, especially commercial services. Of course, you are required to at least to know, to understand the language, the Ukrainian language, and to respond to people in this language as well.
The law doesn't introduce any changes into the criminal code. That is why it doesn't foresee any punishment for not knowing Ukrainian. The article on language inspection, in turn, was taken out of the law for avoiding any speculations.